I am Nia, 34 years old, and for years, my family treated me like a worthless failure. At my parents' anniversary barbecue, my wealthy brother-in-law violently grabbed my 6-year-old daughter. When I stepped in, he threw MMA gloves at my chest and threatened to break my arm and hospitalize me while my family watched. I simply took a deep breath and calculated the exact amount of force needed to shatter his collarbone. What none of them knew was that the woman they mocked as a lowly military gatekeeper was actually an active special ops major who was about to dismantle their entire lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from the people who should be family. The thick summer heat of Atlanta pressed down on my parents' sprawling backyard estate. It was David and Vivian's 40th anniversary, and they had spared no expense to showcase their success to the neighborhood. Caterers navigated around a massive stone fire pit, the smell of smoked brisket mixing with the heavy scent of expensive cigars. I stood near the edge of the patio, sipping a lukewarm glass of water, keeping a watchful eye on my 6-year-old daughter, Zuri. She was happily tossing a soft baseball against the far retaining wall, her laughter the only genuine sound in a yard full of forced networking. I was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, a stark contrast to the designer silk and custom tailoring worn by everyone else. My sister Chloe made sure to point that out the moment I arrived. She had glided over in her $600 heels, a glass of champagne in hand, and loudly asked if I was planning to clean the pool later, since I dressed like the maintenance crew. My parents had just laughed. To them, Chloe was the pinnacle of black excellence. She had married Chad, a wealthy white man, who inherited a massive chain of luxury car dealerships across the East Coast. Chad brought money, status, and connections into my parents' lives, helping pay off my father's business debts. Because of that, Chad was treated like royalty. I, on the other hand, was the embarrassing secret. The single mother whose husband walked out. The woman who supposedly washed out of college to go take a low-level desk job at a military base. They called me a glorified gatekeeper. I never corrected them. The nature of my actual work in the United States military was strictly classified, and frankly keeping them in the dark had always been easier than explaining the truth. Chad was currently holding court near the outdoor bar, heavily intoxicated on premium bourbon. He was loud, his face flushed red as he aggressively shadowboxed the air, demonstrating his amateur MMA moves to a group of my father's friends. He threw a clumsy combination of punches, bragging about his private sparring coach and how he could easily take down anyone in a street fight. His arrogance took up all the oxygen in the space. He thought his money and his size made him invincible. He was a heavily built man, over 200 pounds of gym muscle and unchecked ego, used to intimidating everyone around him. My mother stood nearby, smiling adoringly at her son-in-law, completely ignoring the fact that his reckless swinging was knocking over drink glasses. I looked away from Chad's obnoxious display and turned my attention back to Zuri. She was skipping along the edge of the manicured lawn. I was about to call out to her to tell her it was time to get some food when the ball slipped from her small hands. It bounced off the brick paving, rolled across the patio, and lightly bumped against the front tire of Chad's pristine, custom-ordered Porsche 911, which he had insisted on parking right on the edge of the hardscape to show it off. The tap of the ball against the rubber tire was barely audible, but to Chad it might as well have been a gunshot. The drunken laughter at the bar stopped instantly. Chad whipped his head around his eyes, locking onto the soft baseball resting against his precious car, and then darting to Zuri, who had frozen in place. Her big brown eyes widened in fear as she realized what she had done. Before I could even take a step, Chad lunged forward. He bypassed me completely, his heavy boots pounding against the stone. He did not yell at me. He did not tell her to be careful. He marched straight to my tiny, terrified 6-year-old and grabbed her by the upper arm. He yanked her backward with so much violent force that Zuri's feet left the ground. She let out a piercing, terrified scream that echoed across the entire estate. The mother in me vanished, instantly replaced by the tactical operator that had survived deployments in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. My heart rate dropped. My vision tunneled. everything around me slowed down to precise calculated fractions of a second. I closed the distance between us in 3 rapid silent strides. I did not scream. I did not panic. I simply reached out and clamped my hand around Chad's thick wrist. I applied exactly enough localized pressure to a specific nerve cluster just below his thumb. It was a subtle movement invisible to the horrified onlookers, but the sharp shooting pain forced his fingers to instantly release my daughter's arm. Chad stumbled backward, letting go of Zuri, shaking his hand with a look of confused shock. I immediately pulled Zuri behind my legs, shielding her small, trembling body with my own. She was crying softly, her tiny hands gripping the back of my jeans. I kept my eyes locked dead onto Chad. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute ice in my tone cut right through the humid summer air. Do not ever touch my child again. Instead of realizing, he had just crossed a dangerous line. Chad's confusion morphed into a humiliated, alcohol-fueled rage. His face turned a deep, blotchy crimson. He looked around the patio, seeing my parents and his wealthy friends watching the exchange. His ego could not handle being checked by the woman his wife constantly belittled. He puffed out his chest, stepping aggressively into my personal space, towering over me. "You stupid gatekeeper!" Chad spat the smell of bourbon washing over my face. "Your brat is running around scratching a $200,000 car. Maybe if you were not such a pathetic minimum wage failure of a mother, you could actually afford to pay for the damage she just caused." My sister Chloe rushed over not to comfort her crying niece, but to check the tire of the Porsche. She gasped dramatically, running her manicured fingers over the pristine rubber, pretending there was catastrophic damage. She turned and glared at me. "Nia, are you out of your mind?" she yelled. "Look what your unruly kid did. You owe Chad an apology right now before he calls the police on you." My father, David, stepped forward holding his whiskey glass. "Nia, do not be so defensive," he said, completely ignoring the fact that a grown man had just assaulted his granddaughter. "Chad is right. You need to control your child. You have always been a mess, but bringing this drama to our anniversary is a new low. Just apologize to him and get out of his face." I ignored my family entirely. My focus remained solely on the threat standing inches away from me. "You are drunk, Chad." "Back away," I said, evenly maintaining my defensive stance, keeping my center of gravity low. My muscles were coiled, ready to execute a disabling strike the second he made a physically aggressive move toward me or my daughter. But Chad did not back away. He let out a dark, menacing laugh that made my mother actually nod in agreement from the sidelines. He turned his back on me, marched to the trunk of his precious Porsche, and popped it open. He rummaged inside for a moment before turning back around. In his hands were a pair of black heavy-duty MMA sparring gloves. He walked back towards me with heavy, deliberate steps. Without warning, he threw the thick leather gloves as hard as he could straight into my chest. I caught them effortlessly, letting them drop to the stone floor at my feet without breaking eye contact. "Put them on!" Chad sneered, his voice loud enough for the entire backyard to hear. He cracked his knuckles, a sickening smile stretching across his red face. "You want to act tough in front of my family. Put the gloves on. I will break your arm right here. I will put you in the hospital so your little brat can finally see how completely weak and pathetic her mother really is." I looked down at the heavy black leather gloves resting on the stone patio. In my mind, a familiar cold metronome began to tick. Assess. Breathe. Do not engage until the tactical advantage is absolute. I was not standing in my parents' lavish Atlanta backyard anymore. Mentally, I was back in a combat zone evaluating a hostile threat. I calculated Chad's weight distribution. He was heavy on his right foot, his center of gravity sloppy from the bourbon. His chin was jutted out, completely unprotected. A single precise strike to his trachea would drop him to the pavement in less than 2 seconds. But I could not do that. Not yet. Not with Zuri clutching my jeans, her tiny body trembling against my calves. My silence, my absolute stillness, was a highly trained tactical choice. But to the people standing around the fire pit, it looked exactly like terror. To my family, I was doing exactly what they expected me to do: shrinking, cowering, knowing my place at the bottom of the hierarchy. "What is the matter, Naya?" Chad sneered, kicking one of the gloves toward my sneaker. You act so tough grabbing my wrist, but now you freeze up when a real man steps to you. Pick them up. Show me what that minimum wage military training taught you. Oh, wait, I forgot. You just check identification badges at the front gate. You probably run and hide when the real soldiers walk by. Laughter rippled through the crowd of affluent guests. My sister Chloe stepped forward, her expensive silk dress catching the glow of the string lights overhead. Instead of pulling her out of control husband away, she crossed her arms and glared at me with pure disgust. God, Nia, you are so embarrassing, she groaned, rolling her eyes. He is just trying to teach you a lesson about respect. You come to our parents' anniversary party looking like you rolled out of a dumpster, your kid damages a custom vehicle, and now you are just standing there looking stupid. Pick up the gloves or apologize on your knees right now. My mother. Vivian sighed loudly, waving her hand in the air as if trying to shoo away a bad smell. She has always been a coward, my mother announced to her wealthy friends, not even bothering to lower her voice. Ever since she was a little girl. Quits everything. Could not even keep her marriage together. And now she brings this ghetto behavior to my patio. I swear sometimes I do not even know how she shares my blood. My father, David, chimed in, adjusting his tailored blazer with a look of severe disappointment. We gave you a chance to be part of this family today, Nia. Chad has done more for this family in 2 years than you have in your entire life. Do you have any idea how much money he brings into our accounts? Do not make me call security to escort you off my property. I looked at the faces surrounding me. My own blood. They were watching a drunken, volatile white man threaten to put their black daughter in the hospital, and they were actively cheering him on because his bank account was bigger than mine, because his luxury car dealerships had paid off my father's failing real estate ventures. They had sold their dignity and my humanity for a fleet of Porsches and a country club membership. They genuinely believed I was just a low-level gate guard who had washed out of life. I had let them believe that cover story for years, because the classified nature of my special ops deployments required absolute operational security. I was a ghost in the military system, invisible by design, and right now that invisibility was my greatest weapon. Assess, breathe, do not react. My training dictated that you never escalate a situation when securing a high-value asset. Right now, Zuri was my only asset. I slowly reached one hand behind me, resting it gently on Zuri's curly hair, pressing her closer to my legs to ensure she was completely out of the direct line of fire if Chad decided to lunge again. Seeing my protective gesture, Chad barked a harsh, ugly laugh. Look at her hiding behind her kid. You are pathetic, Nia. No wonder your ex walked out. Who would want a woman who cannot even stand up for herself? I took another aggressive step forward, closing the distance until the smell of expensive cologne and cheap liquor was suffocating. I kept my breathing slow and even. I did not blink. I just stared straight into his bloodshot eyes, memorizing every detail of his aggressive posture. My silence seemed to infuriate him even more. He expected me to cry, to beg, to make a scene that would justify his violence. My absolute stillness was short-circuiting his bully mentality. I told you to pick up the gloves, Chad commanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, guttural growl. I am not going to ask you again. You are going to fight me, or I am going to make you watch while I have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs for assaulting me. I have friends in the Atlanta Police Department, high-ranking friends. One call from me and you go to a holding cell while your little girl goes straight into the foster system. The threat hung in the thick summer air. My sister smiled smugly, clearly thrilled by the power her husband was wielding over me. My parents offered no objection to the idea of their granddaughter being thrown into the system. They simply watched, waiting for me to break. They thought they had me trapped. They thought my silence was the silence of a defeated prey animal waiting for the slaughter. They had no idea it was the calculated silence of an apex predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Let him dig the hole deeper, I told myself. Let them all dig. The sharp clack of designer heels on the stone patio broke the momentary standoff. My older sister Chloe stepped directly into my line of sight, blocking my view of Chad for a split second. She smoothed the skirt of her raw silk dress, a piece that probably cost more than what she assumed I made in a month, and deliberately placed herself shoulder to shoulder with her husband. She did not kneel to check on her 6-year-old niece who was still shaking behind my legs. She did not reprimand the grown man who had just violently yanked a child into the air. Instead, she slipped her perfectly manicured hand through the crook of Chad's thick arm, physically anchoring herself to his rage and validating every ounce of his aggression. "Oh, please, Nia, stop playing the professional victim," Chloe scoffed. Her voice carried that practiced upper crust accent she had spent the last 5 years perfecting, desperately trying to erase any trace of our middle-class Atlanta upbringing. She tilted her chin down at me, her eyes sweeping over my plain t-shirt and jeans with absolute revulsion. "Do not act like Chad is out of line here. You need to watch your kid. That car is a custom import. He has every right to be furious that your unruly brat is using it as a backboard." I stared at my sister. The woman who shared my blood was actively defending a piece of German machinery over the physical safety of her own niece. I kept my breathing regulated. In out. Assess the hostiles. Chloe was not a physical threat, but she was the psychological enabler. She fueled Chad's ego. Without her constant validation, his power in this family would not exist. "You are seriously defending him right now?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet, devoid of the panic they all so desperately wanted to hear. "He just assaulted your niece over a rubber ball tapping a tire." Chloe let out a harsh, theatrical laugh that grated against my ears. "Assaulted," she echoed, shaking her head as she looked around at the guests, inviting them to share in her amusement. "Listen to you. Always so dramatic. Always making everything a massive federal case to cover up your own inadequacies. If you actually parented your child instead of treating her like an accessory to your sad single mother routine, he would not have had to step in." She took a step closer, leaving the safety of Chad's side to get right into my face. The scent of her heavy, expensive floral perfume was nauseating. "This is exactly why your life is a complete disaster, Nia. You refuse to take accountability. You messed up your marriage because you could not act right, and now you are messing up this kid. You show up here eating our parents' food, drinking their liquor, and the second you are asked to show some basic respect to the man who practically keeps this family afloat, you want to cry assault. It is pathetic." I felt Zuri's small fingers tighten their grip on the denim of my jeans. I reached down, stroking her back, to silently promise her she was safe. I did not break eye contact with Chloe. I let her words hang in the hot air, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a defensive response. In interrogation training, we learned that silence makes the arrogant uncomfortable. It forces them to keep talking, to keep exposing their own weaknesses. Chloe despised my silence. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a scowl. "You always do this," she snapped, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "You stand there with that blank, stupid look on your face like you are better than everyone else. Newsflash, Nia. You are nothing. You are a glorified mall cop sitting in a guard shack on some military base. You check ID badges for a living. Do not stand on our parents' patio and look at my husband like you are his equal. He owns half the real estate in this zip code. You do not even own the clunker car you drove here in." The sheer volume of her delusion was almost fascinating. She had completely bought into the narrative of her own supremacy. By marrying a wealthy white man, she believed she had elevated herself above the struggles of the average black woman, and especially above me. To her, I was the cautionary tale. The sister who joined the military because she supposedly had no other options, the sister who got pregnant and got left behind. She used my fabricated struggles to make her own hollow life look like a glittering success story. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for me. "Pick up the gloves, Nia. Or better yet, get down on your knees and apologize to him. Apologize for the car, apologize for your brat, and apologize for ruining this party. If you do not, I swear to God, I will have Chad call his friends at the precinct. We will have you arrested for trespassing and child endangerment." Do you think a judge will give custody to a broke minimum wage failure when her wealthy sister and brother-in-law offered to take the kid in? We would win in a heartbeat, and I would make sure you never saw Zuri again. A dangerous, icy calm flooded my veins. It was the same hyper-focused clarity that washed over me right before breaching a hostile compound. Chloe had just threatened to use the legal system to steal my child. She thought her husband's money and local connections made them untouchable. She was threatening to rip my daughter out of my arms just to prove a point about her own social standing. My operational parameters instantly shifted. This was no longer just about de-escalating a drunken bully. This was about dismantling a localized threat to my family unit. I looked from Chloe's sneering face to Chad, who was standing behind her, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his sweaty face. He genuinely believed his wife was doing his dirty work for him. He thought he had outsourced my humiliation. "Is that the plan, Chloe?" I asked, my tone flat and unnervingly steady. "You are going to call the police on your own sister because my child's toy touched a tire. You are going to use the system against your own blood to protect a man who just threatened to put me in a hospital bed." "Blood does not mean anything when you are a parasite," Chloe fired back without a second of hesitation. "You bring zero value to this family. Chad brings millions. He saved Dad's business. He pays for Mom's country club fees. You just bring shame. So yes, I will call the police on you. I will let Chad break your arm if he wants to. Because you need to learn respect. You need to learn that you are at the bottom of the food chain, and we are at the top." She turned her back to me with a dramatic swish of her silk dress and walked back to Chad, wrapping her arms around his waist. She looked up at him like he was a conquering hero. "See, honey," she cooed loudly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "She is all talk, just a useless, broke coward. Do not waste your energy on her. She is not worth scuffing your knuckles over." Chad puffed out his chest, emboldened by his wife's absolute submission and her vicious attack on me. He stepped around Chloe, kicking one of the MMA gloves closer to my feet. The thick leather skidded across the stone and hit the toe of my sneaker. "You hear that?" he mocked, pointing a thick, trembling finger at my face. "Even your own sister knows you are garbage. Now pick up the damn gloves and fight me, or get on the ground and beg for my forgiveness before I make that phone call to the precinct. I am giving you 5 seconds to decide if you want to leave here in a police cruiser or an ambulance. 1. The countdown began. The crowd of guests watched in hushed, morbid fascination. Nobody stepped forward to intervene. Nobody told Chad he was going too far. My parents stood silently by the outdoor bar, sipping their drinks, completely abandoning me to the wolves they had invited into their home. 2. Chad's voice boomed across the patio. I did not look at the gloves. I kept my eyes locked on his center of mass, calculating the trajectory. I felt Zuri press her wet cheek against my leg. I was not going to kneel. I was not going to beg. And I was absolutely not going to be the victim they so desperately wanted me to be. 3. The mental safety on my training clicked off. The apex predator was fully awake. Before the syllable fully left his lips, a figure suddenly thrust itself between us. But it was not to stop the drunken 200-pound man who had just assaulted a child. It was to stop me. My mother Vivian planted herself directly in front of Chad, shielding his massive frame with her own body. The strategic placement was unmistakable. She was protecting the asset. She looked down her nose at me, her diamond necklace catching the ambient light from the fire pit, her face twisted into a mask of absolute, unadulterated disdain. The sheer weight of her disapproval pressed down on me, suffocating and heavy, demanding immediate submission. "Nia, that is quite enough," she snapped, slapping her hand against her silk-clad thigh in a gesture of maternal authority that felt completely hollow. "You always have to make a spectacle. You always have to embarrass this family in front of our friends. Look around you. You are ruining a perfectly elegant evening with your ghetto attitude." I did not move. I kept my center of gravity low, my hand resting protectively on Zuri, who was still trembling against my legs. "He grabbed Zuri, Mom," I said, keeping my voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear, yet devoid of the hysteria she was trying to provoke. "He physically assaulted a 6-year-old over a bouncing rubber ball. And you are telling me I am the embarrassment." "Do not twist the narrative to play the victim," Vivian hissed. She took a step closer, pointing a flawlessly manicured finger directly at my face. "That child has lacked basic discipline since the day her father walked out on you. Chad was simply doing what you continually refused to do. He was teaching her boundaries. You cannot just march into a civilized environment and let your kid run wild like a street urchin. Chad is family. More importantly, he is a provider." She lowered her voice slightly, leaning in so her words could cut deeper, though the venom in her tone was palpable to anyone standing nearby. He is currently helping your father pay off a massive commercial bank loan that is literally keeping a roof over our heads and saving your father's business from total ruin. Can you not just be obedient and grateful for one single day in your life? My father David moved to stand beside her, presenting a united, impenetrable front against their own daughter. His tailored suit looked impeccable, perfectly pressed, and undoubtedly bought and paid for by the very man threatening to put me in a hospital bed. Your mother is absolutely right, David said, his voice dropping into that booming authoritative register he reserved only for scolding me. You have contributed absolutely nothing of value to this household since you dropped out of law school to go play soldier. You check identification badges at a gate for a living. You are a glorified traffic cop. Chad employs hundreds of people. He is a pillar of this community. When a man of his stature demands an apology for damage to his highly expensive property, you lower your head and you give it to him. I stared at the two people who had brought me into this world. I looked at their defensive postures, their angry eyes, their complete willingness to sacrifice their granddaughter's physical safety to appease a wealthy donor. The illusion of family loyalty shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but cold transactional reality. You are selling your granddaughter's safety to pay off a bank loan, I stated, making sure my voice carried clearly across the patio. The sudden silence from the surrounding guests was deafening. You are standing here defending a drunk who just threatened to break my arm because he writes checks for your country club memberships. How dare you, Vivian shrieked, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Her face flushed an angry, blotchy red. We gave you everything. We paid for the best private schools, the most expensive tutors, and you threw every single advantage away to go be a grunt. You are a failure, Nia. A bitter, resentful failure who cannot stand to see her own sister succeeding. She gestured wildly toward Chloe, who was watching the scene with a triumphant smirk. Chloe secured her future. She secured our future. She married well and built a life to be proud of. All you do is show up here, eat our catered food, drink our liquor, and act like the world owes you some massive debt of gratitude because you put on a uniform and stand in a toll booth all day. Zuri whimpered behind me, burying her face deeper into the denim of my jeans. The sound of her quiet distress was the only thing anchoring me to my restraint. Every instinct drilled into me by special ops training screamed to neutralize the threats in my immediate vicinity. But neutralizing my own parents in front of 60 witnesses was not tactically viable. I reached back, gently stroking Zuri's braids to let her know the shield wall had not fallen. I am not asking for anything from you, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly icy calm that made my father briefly flinch. I have never asked you for a single dime since the day you threw my bags on the porch 10 years ago because I refused to marry a banker I despised. I built my own life. I raised my daughter completely on my own. I am only asking you to act like grandparents instead of bought and paid for lapdogs. David's face flushed a deep, violent purple. The vein in his neck pulsed visibly. You will not disrespect us in our own home, he roared, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. Not in front of our guests, not in front of the man keeping us afloat. He pointed sharply to the heavy leather MMA gloves still resting on the pavement between me and Chad. You want to act like a tough, battle-hardened veteran. You want to disrespect the man who puts food on this table. Then you will face the consequences of your own arrogant actions. You will pick up those gloves and take your punishment from Chad like a supposed soldier. Or you will write a check for $30,000 to fix the damage your brat just did to that vehicle right now. I took a menacing step forward, trying to use his height to intimidate me, completely oblivious to the fact that I had faced down warlords who were twice his size and 10 times as lethal. If you cannot do either of those things, you are going to get down on your knees on this patio and beg for Chad's forgiveness. You will apologize to your sister. And if you refuse, I will personally call the Atlanta police and have you dragged off my property for trespassing and assault. The absolute, unadulterated betrayal settled in my chest, freezing whatever lingering hopes I had left for my parents. They were entirely willing to watch their daughter get brutally beaten by a man nearly twice her weight. They were perfectly willing to watch their 6-year-old granddaughter be permanently traumatized by that violence. They were ready to throw me to the wolves, all for the sake of preserving their shallow, fragile status in Atlanta's high society. Chad pushed past my mother, emboldened by the absolute surrender of my parents. He kicked the glove again, a nasty, victorious sneer twisting his features. You heard your father, Nia. You are completely on your own. Nobody here wants you. Nobody here cares what happens to you. It is time to pay the toll. Blood or money. What is it going to be? I slowly stood up, placing one hand protectively on Zuri's shoulder, and walked toward the outdoor bar. My movement was deliberate, unhurried. Let them think I was retreating. I picked up a crystal tumbler and poured a neat measure of my father's expensive bourbon. The golden liquid caught the light of the fire pit as I swirled it, the clinking of ice cubes, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I took a slow sip, letting the burn of the alcohol mirror the cold fire building inside me. Chloe scoffed, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. Look at her, she said to the gathered crowd, her voice dripping with venom. Acting like she owns the place. You know, Nia, that is exactly why your husband walked out on you. You never knew your place. You always thought you were better than everyone else, but you could not even keep a man interested. The low murmur of agreement from some of the guests was expected. They thrived on drama, especially when it validated their own superiority. Chloe took a step closer, emboldened by the audience. You are just a glorified gatekeeper, she spat, emphasizing the last word like it was a disease. A gatekeeper who got kicked out of the military because you could not handle the pressure. A failed soldier, a failed wife, and now you are trying to be some sort of hero in front of my husband. Do not act tough, Nia. A gatekeeper has no business trying to look dangerous in front of Chad. A got to keep her. The phrase echoed in my mind, a repetitive, hollow insult they clung to. They loved that narrative. It fit their worldview perfectly. The disgraced daughter relegated to checking IDs at a military base entrance, barely scraping by. It was the perfect contrast to Chloe's glittering life of luxury and social climbing. They believed it so completely because it was the only story that allowed them to feel superior. They had absolutely no concept of what it meant to be a special operations major. They could not fathom the rigorous, brutal training, the classified missions in hostile territories, the split-second decisions that meant life or death for my unit. My service record was heavily redacted, classified at the highest levels. To them, my silence about my deployments meant I had failed. I let them believe it because operational security was paramount. But right now, their ignorance was their biggest vulnerability. I took another sip of the bourbon, my expression neutral. The urge to dismantle Chloe's entire fabricated reality was strong, but timing was everything. Assess, breathe, let the enemy expose their flank. You think you are so intimidating, Chloe sneered, stepping even closer, the scent of her floral perfume clashing with the bourbon in my hand. Chad could crush you without breaking a sweat. He trains with actual professionals, not some reject military dropouts. You are nothing, Nia. Just a sad, broke gatekeeper trying to cause trouble because you are jealous of what I have. Jealous, I repeated softly, my voice, calm, almost conversational. The sheer absurdity of her claim was almost amusing. You think I am jealous of a man who abuses children to stroke his own ego? My mother gasped, clutching her pearls in a dramatic display of shock. How dare you, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. Chad provides for this family. He paid off your father's debts. He ensures we maintain our standing in this community. You show up here a failed gatekeeper and dare to insult the hand that feeds us. You are ungrateful, Nia. You always have been. My father nodded vigorously, his face tight with anger. Your mother is right, he added, his voice booming across the patio. You have always been a disappointment. We tried to give you every advantage and you threw it all away to be a grunt. And now you come here disrespecting the man who saved my business. You owe Chad an apology and you owe this family some respect. The united front they presented was sickening. They were completely willing to sacrifice my dignity and Zuri's safety to appease the man bankrolling their extravagant lifestyle. They were bought and paid for their loyalty, purchased with luxury cars and country club fees. You saved his business, Chad, I asked, turning my gaze to the man who was currently flexing his hands, trying to look intimidating. That is very generous of you. I wonder what the return on investment looks like for a dealership owner bailing out a failing real estate venture. Chad's face darkened, the alcohol-fueled bravado slipping slightly. "What are you talking about, you crazy butch?" he growled, taking a step forward. "You do not know anything about my business." "I know enough," I said, setting the tumbler down on the bar with a quiet, definitive click. The shift in my tone was subtle, but it was enough to make Chad hesitate. The apex predator was no longer just observing, it was preparing to strike. Chad shook his head, a harsh, dismissive sound escaping his lips as he tried to wave off my words. He turned his back on me and marched over to his pristine white Porsche. He crouched down with exaggerated care, running his thick fingers over the faint, powdery dust mark left by Zuri's softball on the rubber tire. He stood back up, his face twisted into an ugly mask of manufactured outrage. He pointed a trembling finger at the wheel well. "You think you know enough." Chad spat out, his voice echoing across the silent patio. "You do not know a damn thing about real money, Nia. You live in a fantasy world where actions do not have financial consequences. Look at this. This is a custom matte finish imported directly from Stuttgart. You cannot just wipe this off with a cheap rag. Your feral kid just ruined a $10,000 paint job, and that is before my mechanics even look at the alignment from the impact." I stared at him. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his claim was staggering. A 6-year-old tossing a soft, lightweight baseball had barely tapped the heavy rubber tire. Yet he was standing in front of 60 wealthy guests, claiming catastrophic structural and cosmetic damage. It was a blatant, transparent lie designed entirely to back me into a corner. He knew my cover story. He believed I was a single mother scraping by on a low-tier government salary. He was intentionally creating a financial mountain to crush me under its weight. $30,000, Chad announced, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "That is what you owe me for the damages and the depreciation of the vehicle. And I am being generous by not charging you for my wasted time. I want $30,000, right here, right now." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of my parents' affluent friends. My sister Chloe immediately stepped forward, playing her role perfectly. She clapped a hand over her mouth in mock horror, her eyes widening as she looked at the faint dust smudge on the tire. $30,000, Chloe cried out, shaking her head tragically. "Chad, honey, you know she cannot afford $30. Look at the cheap shoes she is wearing. She buys her clothes at discount stores. How is a gatekeeper supposed to come up with that kind of money?" Chad smiled, a cruel, predatory grin that exposed his teeth. "That is not my problem, Chloe. That is her problem." He turned his attention back to me, taking slow, deliberate steps until he was towering over me again. "What is the matter, Nia?" he taunted, lowering his voice, so only my family and the closest guests could hear the absolute malice dripping from his words. "Did I short-circuit your brain? Let me spell it out for you. You are going to transfer $30,000 into my account today. I know you do not have it sitting in a bank. I know you are probably living paycheck to paycheck, clipping coupons just to feed that kid of yours. So you better start calling whatever payday loan sharks you people use, or you are going to be in a world of legal trouble." My gaze narrowed, locking onto his flushed, arrogant face. I did not blink. I did not let a single ounce of panic show in my eyes. I simply stared at him, a cold, calculating machine processing the absurdity of his extortion attempt. I was demanding $30,000 for a dust smudge on a vehicle that was technically registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A shell company that my federal task force had been monitoring for the last 6 months. I knew exactly how he bought that car. I knew which offshore accounts the money was wired from. I knew the names of the cartel associates who fund the cash through his luxury dealerships to clean their dirty money. He was standing in front of a federal financial investigator trying to extort cash to fix a car bought with drug money. The irony was almost poetic. My father, David, stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of false diplomacy. "Nia, you need to take this seriously." My father lectured, his tone dripping with severe disappointment. "Chad is a highly successful businessman. Time is money for him. You let your child damage his valuable property. This is a matter of personal responsibility, something you have always struggled to understand ever since you dropped out of law school and shamed this family. You cannot just walk through life expecting other people to pay for your mistakes." We are certainly not paying for it, my mother, Vivian quickly added, shooting me a look of pure disgust. We are already dealing with enough stress trying to host a civilized anniversary party. You decided to be a single mother, Nia. You decided to take a dead-end job checking identification badges at a military base. Now you face the consequences of your poor choices. You pay this man what you owe him, and you do it without making a scene. I kept Zuri tucked safely behind my legs. I could feel her small heart racing against my calf. I reached my hand back again, resting it gently on her shoulder, a silent promise that no one was going to hurt her. I looked at the people who shared my blood. They had completely abandoned me to a financial predator. They were perfectly willing to watch me be driven into bankruptcy over a lie simply because Chad held the keys to their social and financial survival. My father had lost his real estate firm years ago. Chad had bailed him out, and in return my father had handed over his dignity and his willingness to protect his own daughter. Chad pulled a sleek, expensive smartphone from his pocket and tapped the screen. I want a wire transfer, he demanded, waving the phone in my face. Or a cashier's check. But we all know your bank account is a joke. So how are we going to do this, Nia? Are you going to sell your beat-up sedan? Are you going to drain whatever pathetic little college fund you set up for the brat behind you? Because I am not leaving here until I am made whole. I was enjoying this. He wanted to break me financially and emotionally in front of an audience. He wanted me to fall to my knees on the stone patio and beg for a payment plan. He wanted the ultimate power trip of owning a black woman who dared to look him in the eye without flinching. Chloe laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the humid air. You know, Chad, maybe she could work it off, my sister suggested, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. She could come clean our pool twice a week, or maybe wash the cars at the dealership. Though I would not trust her near the luxury models. She might let her kid use them as a playground again and cost us another 30,000. I am not running a charity, Chloe Chad said, never taking his eyes off me. I want cash. I want 30 grand, Nia. And I want it before the sun goes down today. If I do not get it, I am calling my lawyers, and I am calling the police. I will garnish your pathetic government wages until you are 90 years old. I will make sure you cannot even afford to rent a cardboard box to sleep in. You messed with the wrong man today. I remained absolutely motionless. I looked past Chad, glancing at the faint powdery dust mark on the tire. A light summer breeze could have blown it away. Then I looked back into Chad's bloodshot eyes. $30,000 for a scuff mark, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing with a chilling, detached calm. That is a very interesting appraisal. Especially for a vehicle that I happen to know requires a specialized import tax. Chad bristled his shoulders, tensing as a flash of genuine confusion crossed his face. Shut your mouth, he barked, stepping closer. You do not know what you are talking about. You owe me the money. Stop trying to change the subject with your nonsense because you know you are completely broke. You are cornered, Nia. Admit it. I let the silence stretch out, watching his chest heave with aggressive breaths. He thought he had me trapped in a cage of poverty and family peer pressure. He thought he could use a 6-year-old's mistake to extort me. I was weaponizing his wealth to crush my spirit. But what Chad, Chloe, and my parents completely failed to realize was that you cannot extort a woman who already holds the keys to your entire criminal empire. All right, everyone, calm down, my father suddenly announced, stepping between me and Chad, playing the role of the wise patriarch solving a crisis. We are family. There is no need to involve lawyers or the police just yet. There is a way to settle this $30,000 debt without anyone going to jail. My eyes darted to my father. I knew that tone. I knew that specific manipulative cadence in his voice. The trap they had been building all evening was finally closing. They had intentionally created this massive, insurmountable crisis, and now they were going to offer the poison solution. The true motive behind this entire confrontation was about to reveal itself. My father reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He did not pull out a checkbook to help his daughter. He pulled out a neatly folded piece of thick legal paper. The camera of my mind tracked the rhythm of my own hand. My fingers rested on the cool marble countertop of the outdoor bar. Tap, tap, tap. One rhythmic strike against the stone for every second it took me to process the absolute betrayal unfolding in front of me. We all know you cannot afford to pay Chad $30,000, Nia, David said. His voice was smooth and practiced. It was the exact tone of a predatory real estate broker closing a hostile deal. You simply do not have the liquidity. But Chad is a reasonable man. We are a family, and family finds solutions. We can settle this debt right now, without involving the authorities, without anyone losing their child to the state. He unfolded the paper and placed it flat on the marble counter right next to my bourbon glass. My fingers continued their steady, relentless rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. I looked down at the bold heading printed at the top of the page. Deed of transfer and relinquishment of property rights. The details typed beneath that heading locked every missing piece of this puzzle into place. It was a transfer deed for my 15% share of my late grandmother's estate. It was a prime parcel of undeveloped commercial land situated right on the edge of a rapidly gentrifying district in South Atlanta. To a casual observer, it was just a patch of overgrown grass and a rusted chain link fence. To a commercial developer, it was a gold mine worth well over $500,000. To a money launderer needing a legitimate real estate front to wash cartel cash, it was absolutely priceless. Chloe leaned over the bar, tapping her manicured nail aggressively against the signature line at the bottom of the page. "It is actually a massive favor, Nia," she insisted, her eyes gleaming with greedy desperation. "That dirt lot is doing nothing for you. You do not have the capital to develop it. You do not have the vision. Chad is willing to take your measly 15% share and wipe the $30,000 debt completely clean. He is basically doing you a charity. Sign it and this whole ugly mess goes away," my mother Vivian urged. She stepped closer to me, her voice dropping into a manipulative, sickeningly sweet register. "You get to walk out of here with your daughter. Chad gets compensated for the damage. Your father and I can finally enjoy our anniversary in peace. It is the only logical choice for someone in your financial position. You owe this to us after everything you have put this family through." My fingers stopped tapping. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I stared at the paper, letting my highly trained mind dissect the situation with mathematical precision. This entire escalation, the thrown MMA gloves, the physical intimidation, the violent threat of calling Child Protective Services, none of it was a spontaneous drunken outburst. It was a carefully engineered ambush. Chad had likely been complaining to my parents for months about needing that specific land parcel for his dealership expansion. My federal task force had already flagged his aggressive real estate acquisitions in that exact zip code. They knew I would never sell my share to him. I had firmly rejected his lowball offers 3 times in the past year alone. So they constructed a crisis. They waited for me to step out of line, or in this case for a 6-year-old child to bounce a toy against a tire, and they sprang the trap. They were staging a financial shakedown disguised as a domestic dispute. I looked from the fraudulent document up to my father. "You brought a property transfer deed to your own anniversary party," I stated. My voice was completely stripped of any familial warmth, resonating with a dangerous hollow clarity. "You walked out onto this patio today planning to extort your own daughter." "Do not use that word." David snapped, his veneer of diplomacy instantly cracking. "Extortion is a crime. This is a settlement. You damaged property. You are being offered a way to pay for it without going to jail. You should be on your knees thanking Chad for being so accommodating instead of standing there accusing me of wrongdoing." Chad smirked, leaning his heavy frame against the bar, invading my physical space once again. "It is a simple business transaction, Nia. You sign the paper, the debt vanishes. You refuse, and I call my buddy at the precinct. They will have a cruiser here in exactly 4 minutes. You will spend the night in a holding cell, and I will still sue you for the 30 grand tomorrow. I will put a lien on your sad little government paycheck until you are dead. Sign the paper." He nudged a silver pen across the marble counter toward me. It rolled and hit my knuckles with a metallic clink. I did not flinch. I did not move to pick it up. I stared at the ink. I stared at the signature line. The absolute depravity of the people standing around me was staggering. My own mother was nodding encouragingly, literally urging me to sign away my grandmother's legacy to a white man who had just violently assaulted her granddaughter. They had stripped away every illusion of parental love. There was nothing left but raw transactional greed. "That parcel is zoned for high-density commercial development," I said, shifting my gaze directly to Chad. The current market appraisal for my 15% is roughly $450,000. And you want me to sign it over to cover a fabricated $30,000 debt for a dust smudge. It is not fabricated! Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the yard. You are just too stupid to understand high-end vehicle maintenance. That land is worthless to a gatekeeper. You cannot even afford the property taxes on it anyway. Chad is taking a massive burden off your hands. Stop being so greedy and sign the damn paper so we can get back to our party. The wealthy guests surrounding us were whispering now, the reality of the shakedown becoming apparent even to the most oblivious observers. But in this circle of extreme wealth, money always protected money. Not a single person was going to intervene to save a supposedly broke single mother from her powerful, affluent family. They were all perfectly content to watch me be financially slaughtered. Look at her, Vivian scoffed, gesturing to me with her champagne flute. She is calculating how she can play the victim. She has always been so incredibly selfish. We give her a lifeline, a way to keep her child out of the foster system, and she stands there calculating pennies. Sign the paper, Nia. Do it now, or I will personally call child services and tell them you are an unfit mother who brings violence into our home. The threat of taking Zuri away was their favorite weapon. They knew she was my heart, my entire world. They assumed the mere mention of losing her would shatter my resolve and force me to capitulate. They thought the fear of the legal system would blind me to the reality of their theft. I looked down at Zuri. She was watching me, her beautiful brown eyes wide but trusting. She did not know what the adults were arguing about, but she knew her mother was a fortress. I gave her a tiny, imperceptible nod. I looked back at the legal document. The wording was sloppy, drafted by a bottom-tier lawyer who thought they could easily bully a civilian into signing a binding contract under severe duress. It was a rookie mistake. A mistake made by arrogant people who vastly underestimated their opponent. My fingers hovered over the silver pen resting against my knuckles. Chad let out a triumphant exhale, thinking my movement signaled defeat. That is it, he mocked, his voice dripping with suffocating condescension. Be a good little soldier and follow orders. I knew you would finally learn how to submit once real consequences were on the table. I reached out, my movements painfully slow and deliberate, keeping every single person on the patio holding their breath. I picked up the silver pen. Chad's smirk widened into a full-blown grin of victory. Chloe crossed her arms, looking at me like I was a peasant finally bowing to a queen. My parents let out synchronized sighs of relief, their financial salvation secured at the cost of my ruin. They truly believed they had broken me. They thought the overwhelming threat of police intervention and crippling poverty had forced the feral animal into total submission. They were completely ready to celebrate their successful heist. I did not pick up the silver pen. Instead, I moved my hand with deliberate, agonizing slowness and picked up the heavy, embossed legal document. I held the thick cardstock in both hands, feeling the textured grain of the paper against my fingertips. I kept my eyes locked dead onto Chad's flushed, expectant face. The silence on the patio was so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the pool pump and the clinking of ice melting in the glasses of the terrified guests around us. I gripped the edges of the transfer deed and ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp, violent sound of tearing paper echoed like a gunshot across the marble bar. I stacked the halves together, ripped them again, and then opened my hands, letting the worthless confetti of their pathetic extortion attempt flutter to the stone pavers directly onto Chad's expensive leather shoes. My mother let out a high, genuine shriek of horror. My father slammed his fist onto the marble counter, his face turning an alarming shade of violet as the reality of his lost financial bailout washed over him. Chloe lunged forward, her mouth hanging open in pure shock, completely unable to process the fact that someone had just told her husband no. But it was Chad whose reaction dictated the next few seconds of this nightmare. The smug, victorious grin was wiped from his face, instantly replaced by a contorted mask of pure, unhinged fury. His broad chest heaved as the alcohol and the public humiliation collided in his system. He had never been defied by anyone in this family. He had bought their absolute obedience with his luxury cars and his bank accounts, and he fully expected to buy mine. When he realized I was completely immune to his financial bullying, his fragile ego shattered entirely. You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic, worthless life, Nia, he roared, spit flying from his lips as he closed the distance between us. I gave you an out. I gave you a generous chance to walk away from this without a criminal record. Now I am going to completely destroy you. He reached into his tailored slacks and yanked out his smartphone, his thick fingers jabbing aggressively at the screen. He held the phone up high, making sure I could see the dialing screen, making sure the entire crowd knew exactly what kind of power he wielded in this city. I am calling Captain Marcus Davis at the Atlanta Police Department right now. Chad bellowed, his voice laced with the terrifying confidence of a man who knew the justice system worked for him and against people who looked like me. We play golf every Sunday at his private club. I donate heavily to his precinct. He personally handles all my corporate security issues. I am telling him that an unstable, violent woman just assaulted me in my own in-laws' backyard and tried to vandalize my property. They will have a squad car here with lights and sirens in under 3 minutes. You are going to be cuffed, dragged through this dirt, and charged with felony property damage and aggravated assault. Good luck making bail on a minimum wage guard salary. Chloe immediately flanked him, her eyes gleaming with a sick, vindictive pleasure. She looked at me not as a sister, but as an enemy combatant she was thrilled to see executed. And what do you think happens to a 6-year-old when her sole guardian gets hauled off to the Fulton County Jail? Chloe taunted, her voice rising shrilly so the entire party could hear her malicious threat. We will call Child Protective Services the second they put the cuffs on you. We will tell the social workers that you are violent, mentally unstable, and entirely unfit to parent a child. You live in a cramped apartment, you have zero savings, and you just attacked a respected business owner unprovoked. They will throw your kid straight into the foster care system tonight. You will lose custody forever, Nia. You will never see her again. The threat of the foster system was the ultimate leverage. It was the nuclear option designed to break any mother's spirit. They were actively conspiring to use the police and the state to rip my daughter out of my arms simply because I refused to sign away my grandmother's land. I looked over at my parents. I gave them one final silent chance to step in to act like human beings instead of greedy accomplices. I waited for my father to tell Chad to put the phone down. I waited for my mother to defend her granddaughter from the threat of a group home. Vivian just crossed her arms and looked away, lifting her chin in stubborn defiance. Maybe a few nights in a state facility will teach that child the basic manners you refuse to instill in her. My mother stated coldly, entirely abandoning her own flesh and blood. David adjusted his tie, his expression devoid of any paternal warmth or protective instinct. You brought this entirely on yourself, Nia. We tried to give you a civilized way out. Now you face the consequences of your own arrogant actions. I will not stop Chad from defending his property. Chad laughed, a harsh, booming sound of absolute triumph. He saw the validation from my parents and felt utterly invincible. But calling the police was not enough for him. He wanted to punctuate his authority. He wanted to prove physically that he controlled my life, my freedom, and my child. He wanted to break me before the sirens even arrived. To drive his point home and establish ultimate dominance, he stepped aggressively into my space, but he did not aim his aggression at me. He looked down at Zuri, who was still hiding behind my right leg, weeping silently in terror. Chad reached his heavy, meaty hand past my hip. Before I could shift my weight to block him, he deliberately, forcefully shoved my 6-year-old daughter. He did not just brush against her. He pushed her backward with the callous disregard of a man swatting away an annoying insect. Zuri lost her footing, instantly stumbling hard over the uneven stone pavers. She fell backward, her small hands shooting out to brace herself against the rough, unforgiving brick of the patio. A sharp, terrified cry tore from her throat as she hit the ground. Blood immediately welled up on her scraped palms, mixing with the dirt from the stone. That was it. The invisible tripwire in my mind snapped. The carefully maintained parameters of civilian engagement permanently shifted. The tactical assessment phase was officially over. The safety was off. My limit officially broke. Chad telegraphed his strike exactly like the undisciplined country club brawler he was. He dropped his right shoulder, shifting his massive 200-pound frame, and pulled his fist back so far I could see the sweat staining the underarm of his expensive custom shirt. He was putting every ounce of his weight and his alcohol-fueled rage into a wild, looping right hook aimed directly at my jaw. He fully expected to feel the sickening crunch of bone. He expected the satisfying thud of my body hitting the stone pavers. He expected a scream of terror that would cement his absolute dominance over this family once and for all. He was certain that violence would force the pathetic minimum wage gatekeeper to finally submit to his wealth and power. He had absolutely no idea that he had just initiated a physical altercation with a Tier 1 operator who had spent the last decade surviving environments where a single miscalculation meant coming home in a flag-draped box. Time immediately dilated, stretching into the slow, hyper-focused reality of the combat zone. The panicked gasps of the wealthy guests, my mother's harsh intake of breath, my sister's cruel, anticipating smirk. It all faded into a dull, distant static. My mind processed the threat with cold mathematical precision. To a trained eye, anger makes an opponent incredibly slow and entirely predictable. In close quarters combat, you are taught that stepping backward is what prey does. It gives the aggressor room to follow through and press their advantage. Predators do not retreat, they close the distance. In the first half second, I moved my left hand firmly but gently, sweeping Zuri entirely out of the collision zone, tucking her safely behind the solid bulk of a heavy stone planter. She was secure. The asset was protected. That was the only clearance I needed. As Chad's heavy leather MMA glove rocketed toward my face, I did not flinch, and I did not raise my hands to cover my head in fear. Instead, I stepped aggressively forward and inside his arc of power. I ducked my head a mere fraction of an inch, allowing the brutal heavy strike to slice through the empty air directly past my ear. The rush of wind from his missed punch fanned my cheek. He had put so much blind, violent force into the swing that missing his target completely destroyed his center of gravity. His momentum carried his upper body dangerously forward, pulling him entirely off balance. He had expected resistance, meeting empty air through his entire nervous system into a momentary catastrophic state of confusion. That fraction of a second of vulnerability was all a trained professional needed to end a fight permanently. In the next second, my right hand shot up, fingers locking around his thick, sweaty wrist with a grip forged from dragging fully geared soldiers out of burning transports. I did not just grab his arm. I seized it instantly, taking control of his remaining kinetic energy. I stepped my right foot sharply and deeply behind his lead leg, effectively destroying his foundation and trapping him in a highly compromised stance. Simultaneously, I brought my left forearm crashing down directly onto his exposed elbow joint. I did not use brute strength. Brute strength is for bar fights. I used applied physics and biomechanics. A human joint is a simple hinge. It is only designed to bend in one specific direction. When forced to bend the opposite way, the structural integrity of the limb fails instantly. I applied exact, calculated, agonizing downward pressure, locking his arm into a rigid, excruciating trap. A sharp, breathless grunt escaped Chad's lips as the searing pain of the joint lock registered in his alcohol-soaked brain. But I gave him absolutely zero time to process the agony or attempt a countermaneuver. He was a hostile threat who had physically assaulted my child. He was going to the ground, using his captured hyper-extended arm as a lever. I dropped my center of gravity, rotated my hips with explosive rotational force, and executed a flawless tactical takedown. The maneuver required minimal effort on my part, utilizing his own staggering weight and downward momentum against him. Chad's expensive leather shoes completely left the patio stones. For one surreal suspended fraction of a second, this massive, arrogant man, who had spent the entire afternoon terrorizing my family and threatening my child, was floating completely helpless in the humid Atlanta air. The look of absolute, unadulterated terror that flashed across his flushed face as he realized he had entirely lost control of his own body was something I would remember for the rest of my life. He was no longer the untouchable millionaire. He was just a body in freefall. Gravity and my downward driving force took over with ruthless efficiency. Chad slammed into the solid stone patio with a deafening, bone-rattling thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of the estate. The impact was brutal. The air was violently expelled from his lungs in a wet, choking, agonizing gasp. The sheer force of his 200-pound frame hitting the unforgiving brick sent a shockwave across the yard, rattling the crystal champagne flutes resting on the nearby catering tables. Exactly 2.5 seconds had passed since he had decided to throw that punch. He bounced slightly off the hard pavers, his limbs splayed out at awkward angles. His pristine, custom-tailored trousers were instantly covered in dirt-spilled drinks and the ash from the nearby fire pit. He lay there gasping like a beached fish, his eyes wide and unseeing, as his nervous system short-circuited from the sudden catastrophic impact. The breath had been knocked completely out of him, leaving him making pathetic wheezing sounds as he struggled to pull air back into his paralyzed lungs. I did not release my grip. I smoothly transitioned my weight, dropping my right knee directly and heavily onto his exposed throat, pinning him entirely to the stone floor. I kept his right arm pulled taut, maintaining the joint lock at an angle that promised immediate dislocation if he even thought about twitching a muscle. I knelt over him, my posture perfectly straight, my breathing slow, rhythmic, and entirely undisturbed. I had not even broken a sweat. My heart rate had barely elevated above a resting pace. I looked down into the terrified, watering eyes of the man who had just promised to put me in a hospital bed. The entire backyard had descended into an absolute suffocating silence. It was a silence so profound, so thick with shock and disbelief, that it felt like the air had been sucked completely out of the space. 60 wealthy guests, my parents and my cruel sister, were all frozen in place like statues. Nobody screamed. Nobody moved to intervene. Nobody could comprehend what their eyes had just witnessed. They had spent the last hour watching Chad verbally abuse me, entirely convinced that I was a weak, pathetic target who would eventually cower and submit. They had fully expected to watch me get brutally beaten by a man twice my size. They had mentally prepared themselves to step over my bleeding body and continue their luxury anniversary party. Instead, they had just watched the quiet, unassuming single mother dismantle their most powerful, aggressive family member with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a specialized weapon. They had just seen a level of professional lethal violence that did not exist in their sheltered country club world. Chad let out a weak, pathetic whimper, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as my knee applied steady, controlled pressure to his airway. He raised his free, trembling left hand, weakly tapping the stone patio in a desperate gesture of submission. The big, untouchable brawler was tapping out to the woman he had just called a failure. I leaned down, bringing my face just inches from his sweating, terrified features. My voice was completely devoid of anger. It was stripped of all emotion, resonating with a terrifying clinical detachment that made the guests standing nearby physically flinch. "You wanted to see what my training taught me," I whispered, ensuring every single syllable was carved into his memory. "You wanted to know what kind of woman hides behind a gate. This is what it looks like, Chad. This is what happens when you mistake operational discipline for weakness. If you ever breathe in the direction of my daughter again, I will not stop at the pavement. I will put you in the ground." His eyes bulged in pure terror. He nodded frantically, a desperate, jerky movement acknowledging the absolute reality of my promise. He knew with absolute certainty that he was inches away from a permanently life-altering injury. The arrogant, wealthy bully had finally met the apex predator, and he was begging for his life on the dirty patio stones. I held him there for 5 more agonizing seconds, letting the humiliation and the fear burn deeply into his mind, letting the entire crowd absorb the undeniable shift in power before I finally prepared to release the pressure. I pressed my knee deeper into the soft tissue of his throat, applying just enough calculated pressure to restrict his airflow without crushing his windpipe. I kept his right arm pinned at an excruciating angle, pushing the shoulder joint to the absolute limit of its structural capacity. One more fraction of an inch, and the rotator cuff would tear, completely severing tendons and permanently destroying his mobility. Chad knew it. His body was entirely paralyzed by the blinding, searing agony radiating from his shoulder and the terrifying inability to draw a full breath. Looking down at him from that dominant vantage point, the illusion of his supremacy completely evaporated. This was the man who had swaggered around my parents' estate all afternoon, waving his wealth like a weapon and treating my family like his personal employees. He was the untouchable millionaire, the white savior who had bailed out my father's business, the untouchable titan of Atlanta real estate. But down on the hard, dirty brick of the patio, stripped of his checkbook and his expensive cars, he was nothing more than a fragile, terrified bully. A high, thin wail ripped from his throat, echoing across the perfectly manicured lawn. It was a pathetic, wretched sound, like a slaughtered pig squealing for its life. Tears streamed down his red, bloated face, mixing with the sweat and dirt smeared across his cheeks. He thrashed his free hand against the stone pavers, tapping frantically, in a desperate, humiliating plea for mercy. "Please," he wheezed, spit bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Please, you are breaking it." I did not move. I did not loosen my grip by a single millimeter. I remained locked in my crouch, my posture perfectly aligned, my breathing slow, deep, and rhythmic. I had not shed a single drop of sweat. My heart rate hovered at a steady, calm tempo, exactly as it had during high-stakes extractions in combat zones. I was completely composed, a stark, terrifying contrast to the blubbering, broken man trapped beneath my knee. The guests surrounding us stared in absolute horror, watching the woman they had mocked as a minimum-wage gatekeeper dismantle their most powerful peer without even breaking a sweat. The profound silence of the backyard was suddenly shattered by a blood-curdling shriek. Chloe finally snapped out of her paralyzing shock. Her mind simply could not process the sight of her wealthy, powerful husband being physically dominated by the sister she despised. To Chloe, Chad was her meal ticket, her status symbol, her entire identity in this affluent circle. Seeing him pinned to the ground, crying and begging, was not just an attack on him. It was a direct assault on her carefully curated reality. "Nia, let him go!" Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You are going to kill him." She hiked up the skirt of her expensive raw silk dress, abandoning all pretense of high society elegance, and charged at me like a feral animal. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. She raised her hands, curling her fingers into claws, fully intending to rake her sharp acrylic nails across my face and rip me away from her husband. She expected me to cower. She expected me to flinch and release my hold the moment she mounted a counterattack. She still believed she held the power of the older dominant sister. She was entirely wrong. As Chloe closed the final few feet between us, I did not shift my weight. I did not loosen my physical control over Chad. I simply turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto hers. I did not yell. I did not issue a verbal threat. I just looked at her with the cold, dead, hollow stare of a soldier who had looked true violence in the face and survived. It was a look completely devoid of empathy, warmth, or familial connection. It was the absolute chilling emptiness of a predator warning its prey that stepping 1 inch closer would result in immediate catastrophic destruction. The effect was instantaneous. Chloe slammed on the brakes so hard her designer heels skidded against the stone patio, nearly sending her tumbling backward. She froze mid-stride, her arms still raised in the air, her fingers still curled into claws. The hysterical scream died in her throat, replaced by a sudden suffocating gasp of genuine terror. She looked into my eyes and saw the truth I had kept hidden for a decade. She realized in that split second that she was not looking at a helpless single mother or a failed law school dropout. She was looking at a highly trained lethal operator who could snap her neck just as easily as I was currently breaking her husband's shoulder. The sheer, overwhelming reality of my capability crashed down on her, freezing the blood in her veins. Chloe's arms slowly dropped to her sides, her hands trembling violently. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw breath, her eyes wide and unblinking, locked in a state of absolute paralysis. She could not speak. She could not move. She was completely trapped by the invisible, suffocating weight of my gaze. "Stay exactly where you are, Chloe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying the sharp, unmistakable edge of a direct military command. It sliced through the humid summer air, freezing the entire patio in place. "If you take one more step toward me, I will consider you an active hostile threat, and I promise you I will not be nearly as gentle with you as I am currently being with your husband." Chloe swallowed hard, a tiny pathetic whimper escaping her lips. She took a slow, trembling step backward, putting distance between herself and the violence she had so eagerly encouraged just moments ago. Her arrogant facade had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, trembling woman who finally understood that her money and her status could not protect her from the consequences of her own cruelty. My parents stood paralyzed by the outdoor bar, their faces ashen, completely unable to intervene. David's jaw hung slack, the glass of expensive bourbon trembling in his hand. Vivian clutched the edge of the marble counter, her eyes darting frantically between me, the broken man beneath my knee, and the horrified faces of her wealthy friends. Their perfect, curated anniversary party had transformed into a brutal display of primal dominance, and they were completely powerless to stop it. I turned my attention back to Chad, who was still weeping softly beneath my knee, his face pressed against the dirty stone pavers. The fight had completely drained out of him, replaced by the desperate singular instinct to survive. "You wanted me to bow, Chad," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You wanted me to kneel on this patio and beg for your mercy. You thought you could use your bank account to purchase my submission. You thought you could threaten my child and walk away untouched." I leaned down slightly, bringing my lips close to his ear, ensuring he heard every single word over the sound of his own ragged breathing. "You do not own me. Your money does not own me. And if you ever put your hands on my daughter again, I will not just break this arm. I will dismantle your entire existence. Do you understand me?" Chad nodded frantically, a pathetic jerky motion that scraped his cheek against the rough brick. "Yes," he choked out, his voice hoarse and broken. "Yes, I understand. Please, just let me go." The high-angle perspective of my mind captured the entire scene perfectly. The wealthy, arrogant bully pinned to the ground and crying for mercy. The vicious, enabling sister frozen in terror. The complicit parents stripped of their power and prestige. The entire toxic hierarchy of my family had been violently inverted in the span of 3 minutes. They had demanded respect through extortion and abuse. I had commanded it through absolute, undeniable strength. I kept him pinned for 3 more seconds, letting the silence and the humiliation sear itself permanently into his memory. Then, with a smooth, fluid motion, I released the pressure on his shoulder and stood up, stepping back from his trembling body, ready for the next phase of this confrontation to begin. I shifted my weight smoothly, lifting my knee from the soft tissue of his throat and releasing the agonizing lock on his shoulder joint. The entire perspective of the backyard seemed to physically widen, pulling back to reveal the absolute devastation I had just inflicted on their carefully curated social hierarchy. Chad immediately curled into a tight fetal position on the dirty brick pavers. He clutched his arm to his chest, violently taking in greedy, desperate gasps of air as his paralyzed lungs finally began to function again. I did not spare him a second glance. I turned my back on the man who had just threatened to put me in a hospital, walked over to the plush patio chair I had occupied earlier, and calmly sat down. I crossed my legs and rested my hands loosely in my lap. I did not run. I did not try to explain myself to the horrified crowd of wealthy onlookers. I simply sat in the center of their pristine, expensive world, an immovable force of nature. My father was the first to break the paralyzing shock. His hands were shaking violently as he plunged them into the pockets of his tailored trousers, frantically searching for his smartphone. His face was contorted with a mixture of absolute terror and unrestrained fury. He looked at me, not as his daughter, but as a dangerous rogue element that had just destroyed his financial lifeline. "You have completely lost your mind," Nia David roared, his voice cracking as he finally pulled his phone free. "You are a violent, unstable menace. I am calling the police right now. You belong in a cage for what you just did to Chad." "Call them," I replied. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of any adrenaline or panic. The sheer normalcy of my tone seemed to unnerve him even more than the physical violence had. "In fact, use that special country club connection Chad loves to brag about. Call Captain Davis directly. Tell him there has been an assault at the Washington estate. Make sure you tell him to send multiple units." My mother, Vivian, was already in full damage control mode. She was physically trembling, completely ignoring the fact that her 6-year-old granddaughter was still hiding behind a stone planter. Instead, she rushed to the outdoor bar, grabbing napkins and a glass of water, fluttering around the outskirts of where Chad lay groaning on the ground. She did not dare touch him, terrified of doing the wrong thing, so she turned her panic toward her affluent friends. "I am so incredibly sorry you all had to witness this," Vivian babbled to a group of shocked neighbors, her voice pitching high with forced, desperate civility. She has always been deeply disturbed. She could not handle the discipline of the military, and clearly it broke her brain. We tried to get her help, but she refuses to integrate into civilized society. Please do not let this ruin the evening. The authorities will be here shortly to remove her from the premises. She was actively building the defense strategy for the man who had just assaulted her granddaughter. She was laying the groundwork to ensure the police would view me as a hysterical, dangerous black woman who had snapped without provocation. She was serving me up on a silver platter to protect her own social standing. On the ground, Chad was finally regaining his ability to speak. The fear that had paralyzed him was slowly being replaced by a venomous, humiliated rage. He struggled to push himself up into a sitting position, leaning heavily against his wife. Chloe was sobbing loudly, stroking his uninjured arm, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it practically vibrated in the humid air. "You are a dead woman," Chad rasped, spitting a mixture of saliva and blood from where he had bitten his lip during the takedown. His chest heaved erratically. "You hear me. You are going away for a very long time. I am going to make sure the prosecutor charges you with attempted murder. You attacked me from behind like a coward." I was already rewriting the narrative. He was banking on his privilege, his wealth, and his skin color to completely overwrite the reality of what 60 people had just witnessed. He knew that in a wealthy Atlanta suburb, the word of an affluent white business owner would always carry more weight than the word of a single black mother, especially when her own parents were actively corroborating his lies. "Tell them," Chloe Chad demanded, gripping his wife's silk dress. "Tell everyone exactly what happened. She went crazy. I just asked her to watch her kid, and she tackled me to the ground. She tried to snap my neck. You all saw it." Chloe nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Yes, baby, I saw it. We all saw it. She is a psychotic animal. I am going to testify against her myself. I will make sure the judge takes her kid away tonight." I sat back in my chair, listening to them construct their airtight, fabricated reality. I did not interrupt. I did not defend myself. I just let them weave their web of lies, knowing that every single false accusation they uttered was about to backfire with catastrophic, life-altering consequences. Zuri crept out from behind the stone planter, her small eyes wide with confusion and lingering fear. I held out my hand, and she immediately ran to my side. I lifted her onto my lap, wrapping my arms securely around her waist, resting my chin on top of her curly hair. We sat together in the eye of the storm, surrounded by enemies who shared our blood. The wail of sirens cut through the oppressive summer heat long before the vehicles actually arrived. The sound grew louder, multiplying as multiple squad cars rushed through the exclusive gated neighborhood. My father stood at the edge of the driveway, waving his arms frantically to guide the officers onto the property. The heavy iron side gates of the estate were pushed open. Red and blue emergency lights washed over the pristine landscaping, casting long, erratic shadows across the stone patio. A team of patrol officers burst into the backyard. Their hands rested instinctively on their utility belts, their eyes rapidly scanning the crowd for the active threat. The guests parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path that led directly to where I sat calmly with my daughter. Walking just behind the patrol officers was a tall, broad-shouldered man in the crisp, authoritative uniform of a police captain. Captain Marcus Davis. He had the rugged, ruddy complexion of a man who spent his weekends on expensive golf courses and his weekdays managing the security interests of Atlanta's most powerful residents. He strode onto the patio with the arrogant confidence of someone who fully expected to control the situation. The moment Chad saw the uniform, a twisted, triumphant smile broke through his pain. He pushed himself up higher against Chloe, using his uninjured arm to gesture frantically toward the police. "Marcus," Chad yelled, his voice cracking with desperate, vindictive joy. "Marcus, get over here right now. Thank God you are here." Captain Davis stopped, his eyes widening in genuine shock as he recognized the wealthy dealership owner sitting in the dirt covered in ash and spilled liquor. Chad Davis said, stepping quickly toward the center of the patio, waving his officers forward. "What the hell happened to you? Are you all right? We got a call about a violent assault." "She tried to kill me," Chad screamed, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at me. He did not care about the truth. He only cared about establishing his victimhood immediately to his friend in power. "That crazy, violent butch just tried to murder me in cold blood. I was standing here minding my own business, trying to protect my car from her feral kid, and she tackled me. She used some kind of illegal chokehold. She tried to snap my shoulder out of its socket and crush my windpipe." My mother. Vivian rushed forward, inserting herself directly into the police captain's line of sight, eager to validate the wealthy victim. "Officer, it is true," Vivian gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. "I am her own mother, and I am telling you, she is completely out of control. She is a military dropout with severe mental issues. She attacked my son-in-law without any provocation whatsoever. You need to remove her from my property immediately before she hurts someone else." Captain Davis signaled to his patrol officers. Two heavily armed cops immediately stepped forward, their hands hovering over their handcuffs, their eyes locked onto me. They saw exactly what they had been primed to see: a dangerous, unstable aggressor sitting calmly after committing a brutal assault. "Put her in cuffs right now," Marcus Chad demanded, his voice echoing with absolute entitlement. "Do not even read her rights. Just drag her out of here. I want her locked up in maximum security for aggravated assault. And I want you to call child services immediately. That kid is not safe with her. Put the brat in a state facility tonight. I am pressing full charges and I am suing her for everything she is worth." Captain Davis nodded, his expression hardening into a mask of professional authority. He turned his attention away from his wealthy golfing buddy and focused entirely on the woman sitting quietly in the patio chair. He squared his shoulders, preparing to issue the command that would authorize his officers to forcefully remove me from the premises. He took two confident, aggressive steps toward my chair. Captain Davis reached toward the heavy utility belt resting on his hip. The metallic clinking of the steel handcuffs snapping out of their leather pouch cut through the humid night air. He moved with the practiced swagger of a man who owned the city, a man accustomed to cleaning up messes for his affluent friends without asking any difficult questions. He expected to look down and see a terrified, hysterical woman. He expected easy compliance. He had absolutely no idea he was stepping into a trap that would permanently alter the trajectory of his career. As he took that third and final step, the warm, ambient glow from the string lights overhead illuminated my face perfectly. I did not look away. I simply tilted my chin up and met his gaze with absolute, unyielding authority. I watched the exact millisecond his brain processed the facial recognition. It was a physical transformation. The confident, arrogant swagger evaporated instantly. His broad shoulders violently jerked. The color completely drained from his ruddy, sun-weathered face, leaving him looking like a man who had just stepped on a live landmine. The heavy steel handcuffs slipped from his grasp, dropping back against his hip with a dull thud. He froze, his polished boots planted firmly on the stone pavers. Then, in front of 60 wealthy guests, my horrified parents, my sneering sister, and her bleeding husband, Captain Marcus Davis of the Atlanta Police Department snapped his spine perfectly straight. He brought his right foot sharply against his left. The distinct, crisp sound of his boot heels clicking together echoed across the silent patio. Major Washington Davis choked out his voice, completely stripped of its former arrogance, replaced by a thick, unmistakable layer of pure panic. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly as he stood at strict military attention. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize. I had absolutely no idea you were present on these premises." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not just quiet, it was a complete vacuum of sound. You could have heard a single bead of sweat drop onto the bricks. Chad, who was still clutching his severely hyperextended shoulder on the ground, blinked rapidly. The bourbon and the blinding physical pain were muddling his cognitive functions. "Marcus, what the hell are you doing?" Chad wheezed, his face twisting into a mask of pure confusion and renewed anger. "Arrest her." Put the cuffs on her right now. What are you waiting for? Chloe rushed forward, her expensive raw silk dress rustling loudly in the quiet yard. She grabbed the sleeve of the police captain's uniform, desperately trying to reassert her husband's dominance. She could not comprehend the sudden shift in power. Marcus, stop joking around, Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and demanding. She is dangerous. She is a completely unhinged gate guard who just tried to murder your friend. Take her to jail right now before I call the mayor's office. Captain Davis violently yanked his arm away from my sister's grasp, as if her touch would physically burn him. He did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked rigidly on me, terrified that a single wrong move would end his entire livelihood. Do not touch me. Chloe Davis snapped, his voice trembling with contained terror. And shut your mouth before you make this infinitely worse for yourselves. He turned his attention fully back to me, the sweat now visibly pooling on his forehead. Major, I was dispatched to a domestic disturbance. I was told a violent intruder was assaulting the homeowners. Had I known it was you, ma'am, I would have managed this dispatch entirely differently. I remained seated, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to stew in his own catastrophic miscalculation. You brought a tactical unit to my parents' anniversary party to arrest a black woman without conducting a preliminary threat assessment. Captain Davis. I stated, my voice smooth and lethal. You walked onto this patio ready to slap cuffs on me solely because a drunk civilian told you to. Is that standard operating procedure for the Atlanta Police Department now, or is that a special service you only provide to your wealthy golfing buddies? Davis visibly swallowed, again his posture rigid. No, ma'am. That was a severe error in judgment on my part. I take full responsibility. I will handle this situation immediately. My mother. Vivian gripped the edge of the marble bar so hard her knuckles turned white. Her perfect, curated reality was fracturing in real time. Major Vivian repeated the words, sounding completely foreign and bitter on her tongue. What do you mean, Major? She checks identification badges at a toll booth. She is a low-level military reject. Marcus, you are confused. You have the wrong person. Captain Davis finally turned to look at my parents, his expression a mixture of profound pity and absolute dread. Vivian, are you completely out of your mind? He demanded, his voice hushed but incredibly harsh. She is not a gate guard. Your daughter is a highly decorated special operations major. She is currently serving as a senior financial investigator for the Federal Anti-Money Laundering Task Force. She outranks every single law enforcement officer in this state. She has federal clearance levels that I am not even legally allowed to know the names of. The collective gasp from the wealthy guests swept across the patio like a sudden gust of wind. My father, David, stumbled backward, his knees hitting a patio chair, and he collapsed into it. His jaw literally hung open. Federal investigator, David whispered, the color draining from his face as he stared at me like I was a complete stranger. That is a lie, Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. She pointed a shaking finger at me, refusing to let go of her false superiority. She is broke. She drives a beat-up sedan. She wears cheap clothes. Look at her. She is nothing. Chad, tell him. Tell Marcus to arrest her. Stop letting her play these stupid mind games. But Chad was no longer demanding my arrest. The angry red flush of his face had vanished, replaced by an ashen, sickly gray. He was a man who ran a multi-million-dollar network of luxury car dealerships built on a mountain of incredibly shady accounting. Hearing the words Federal Anti-Money Laundering Task Force hit him much harder than the physical blow to his shoulder ever could. The realization crashed over him, paralyzing him completely. He was staring at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I slowly stood up from the patio chair. The movement was fluid, controlled, radiating absolute authority. The two heavily armed patrol officers who had stepped forward to arrest me earlier immediately took a massive step backward, instinctively recognizing the lethal command presence of a superior officer. Stand your men down, Captain, I ordered. The tone was not a request. It was a direct military command. Stand down, Davis barked at his officers instantly. Fall back to the perimeter, now. The officers scrambled backward, putting their hands far away from their utility belts, securing the edges of the patio, but offering zero threat to me. I walked over to the marble bar standing directly in front of my trembling mother and my shell-shocked father. I looked down at the torn pieces of the fraudulent property transfer deed, still scattering the patio stones around Chad's expensive leather shoes. "You spent the entire evening calling me a failure," I said, making sure my voice carried to every single guest standing in the yard. "You allowed this man to physically assault my child. You tried to extort my grandmother's land to pay off a fabricated debt. And you did all of it because you thought I was powerless to stop you. You thought your money and your white husband made you completely untouchable in this city." I reached into the front pocket of my plain denim jeans. My sister Chloe shrank back, genuinely terrified of what I might pull out. My parents held their breath. Captain Davis stood rigidly at attention, sweating profusely, waiting for the execution order. "But you see, Chloe," I continued, my gaze locking onto her terrified, tear-streaked face, "the true mark of power is not shouting about how much money you have. It is not abusing people you think are weaker than you. True power is doing the work in the dark. It is gathering the intel while everyone else is busy showing off." I pulled my hand out of my pocket. I did not have a weapon. I did not have a badge. I simply held a small silver encrypted USB drive. I held it up so the ambient light caught its metallic surface. "You want to talk about calling the authorities, Chad?" I asked, turning my attention back to the broken man on the ground. "Let us talk about the authorities. Because Captain Davis is right. I am a senior financial investigator. And I did not come to this anniversary party to eat barbecue. I came here to deliver a message." I stepped off the grass and walked directly toward where Chad was still struggling to catch his breath on the patio stones. The silver USB drive in my hand caught the glow of the string lights above us. I held it out so he could see it clearly. "For 10 years, you all sat around mahogany dining tables and country club patios, laughing at the military dropout. You built an entire mythology around my supposed failure to make yourselves feel exceptional. You truly believed I spent my days standing in a toll booth checking identification cards because that was the only narrative your fragile egos could tolerate." I stopped right in front of him. My shadow fell over his trembling body. "I am not a gateguard, Chad. I am a senior financial investigator for the Federal Anti-Money Laundering Task Force. The base you love to mock is the regional headquarters for a joint task force between the Department of Defense and the Department of the Treasury. For the past 6 months, my specific assignment has been tracking the flow of illicit narcotics revenue moving up the East Coast. And do you want to know whose name kept popping up on the shell company ledgers during my audits?" Chad stared up at me, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic raspy squeak came out. He knew exactly what was on that drive. Chloe lunged forward again but stopped several feet away, keeping her distance after my previous warning. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her voice trembling with desperation. "You are lying. You are making this up because you are jealous. Chad is a legitimate businessman. He owns 7 luxury dealerships. Hun owns 7 industrial-sized washing machines." "Chloe." I corrected her, my voice sharp and loud enough for every lingering guest to hear. "Your husband does not sell cars to make a living. He uses overpriced European imports to clean millions of dollars in dirty cash for a cartel operating out of Baltimore. We have been tracking the wire transfers from his dealerships to those offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands since January. We have the tax anomalies. We have the falsified import manifests. We even have the recorded phone calls between him and his suppliers. Every single pair of designer shoes in your closet, every luxury vacation you take, it is all funded by blood money." My mother Vivian let out a strangled gasp. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Her perfectly styled hair was beginning to frizz in the humidity, but she did not even notice. She looked from me to Chad, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "David," she whispered, grabbing my father's arm. "David, tell her to stop. Tell her this is a mistake. He is our son-in-law. He saved your business." My father looked like he was going to vomit. His tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. He took a hesitant step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Nia, please," he stammered, his booming patriarchal voice reduced to a pathetic wavering plea. If this is true, we had absolutely no idea. We thought he was just highly successful in automotive retail. "You have to believe us. We would never associate with criminals. You associated with whoever wrote the biggest check. I shot back, turning my lethal gaze onto the man who had demanded I get on my knees just 10 minutes ago. You did not care where the money came from, David. You only cared that it kept you in this mansion and kept the country club dues paid. You let this criminal into your home. You let him disrespect your daughter. You watched him lay his hands on your 6-year-old granddaughter, and you defended him because his dirty money was propping up your fabricated lifestyle. I looked back down at Chad. The physical pain in his hyperextended shoulder had been completely eclipsed by the realization that his entire criminal empire was collapsing in front of his wealthy in-laws. He was sweating profusely, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. You thought you were so untouchable, Chad, I said, leaning down slightly to ensure he heard every word. You thought your money and your white skin gave you the absolute right to bully a black woman on a patio. You thought you could threaten me with your local police buddies. You thought wrong. You brought a localized ego trip to a federal investigation. I tapped the silver USB drive against the palm of my hand. This drive contains the finalized indictment warrants. I brought it here tonight because I needed to confirm one final piece of the puzzle. I needed to know if my family was complicit in the laundering operation. I needed to know if my father's failing real estate firm was being used as a secondary wash for your cartel cash. David let out a loud, terrified groan and actually collapsed to his knees on the grass. Nia, no. I swear to God I did not know anything about cartels. He just offered me a bridge loan. I signed some papers. That is it. I swear on your mother's life. Please, Nia, you are my daughter. You cannot let them take me to federal prison. I stared at the man begging on the lawn. The mighty patriarch who had just ordered me to beg for Chad's forgiveness was now weeping, openly terrified of losing his freedom. The irony was suffocating. I am not the one who decides who goes to prison, David, I stated coldly. I just follow the money. And the money says this entire family has been living on a mountain of felonies. Captain Davis, who was still standing rigidly at attention near the edge of the patio, cleared his throat nervously. Major Washington, ma'am, he started, his voice cracking. If you have federal warrants, my officers and I can assist with the apprehension. We can take him into custody right now. He was desperately trying to save his own career, eager to throw his former golfing buddy to the wolves to prove his utility to a federal officer. It was a pathetic display of self-preservation. I do not need your assistance, Captain, I replied without looking at him. Your involvement in this situation is already being reviewed by Internal Affairs. You can wait by your cruiser. Davis swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, and immediately stepped back into the shadows. He knew his career was over. The dominoes were falling rapidly, and everyone on this patio realized there was absolutely no escape from the consequences of their actions. Chloe suddenly threw herself onto the ground next to Chad. She grabbed his uninjured arm, her face twisted in a mixture of denial and sheer panic. "Tell her it is a lie," Chad, Chloe screamed, shaking him violently. "Tell her you do not know anything about any cartels. Tell her she is just a crazy, jealous liar making things up to ruin our anniversary party. Tell them." But Chad could not speak. He was staring at the silver USB drive in my hand, like it was a loaded weapon pointed directly between his eyes. The reality of federal prison, the asset seizures, the complete destruction of his affluent life, it had finally broken his spirit entirely. He was a ruined man, and he knew it. He just closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the dirty stone pavers in absolute defeat. I straightened my posture, feeling the cool night breeze against the back of my neck. The heavy, oppressive weight of my family's expectations and judgments had been completely incinerated. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the disappointment. I was the architect of their downfall, and I had built it with the very truth they had spent a decade trying to ignore. I slipped the USB drive back into the front pocket of my jeans. I looked at the wealthy, terrified guests who were now frantically trying to edge toward the exits, eager to distance themselves from a federal crime scene. The party was officially over. The illusion was shattered. The only thing left was the execution of justice. I tossed the small silver drive onto the marble countertop. The sharp clack of metal hitting stone sounded like a judge's gavel echoing across the dead silent patio. I looked down at the man who was still clutching his destroyed shoulder, his breath hitching in his throat. "You were going to put me in jail, Chad?" I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying amusement. "You were going to use your local police connections to lock me in a cell and throw my daughter into the foster system. Did you honestly think I drove to this anniversary barbecue just to eat brisket and let you insult me?" Chad could not form words. His mouth opened and closed, his bloodshot eyes darting from the USB drive on the bar to my face. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his situation was paralyzing his vocal cords. For the last 6 months, my federal task force has been tracking every single wire transfer, every import manifest, and every corporate tax filing associated with your name, I stated, stepping slightly closer so he was forced to look up at me. "Your luxury car dealerships are not successful because you are a brilliant businessman. You are a terrible businessman. Your dealerships are nothing but a massive, highly illegal money laundering front for an East Coast drug cartel." A collective gasp swept through the remaining guests. The affluent doctors, lawyers, and country club socialites, who had been sipping champagne just minutes ago, were now physically backing away, desperate to distance themselves from a man who had just been publicly linked to a major criminal syndicate. "It is a textbook placement and layering scheme." I continued, stripping away every ounce of his false prestige with cold, hard facts. "You take in millions of dollars of illicit cash from the cartel. You generate fake sales invoices for custom Porsches and high-end Mercedes that do not actually exist on your showroom floor. You report that dirty cash as legitimate retail profit, pay the local taxes to make it look clean, and funnel the rest straight into offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. You thought you were a genius. You thought because you wore expensive suits and donated to the Police Benevolent Fund, the federal government would never look twice at your accounting." Chad let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. He knew exactly what I was saying was true. He knew the paper trail was real, and he knew that facing federal anti-money laundering charges meant his life as a wealthy, untouchable elite was permanently over. Chloe pushed herself off the ground, her expensive raw silk dress now wrinkled and stained with dirt. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her perfectly curated high society image completely shattered. She pointed a shaking finger at me, refusing to let go of her delusion. "You are lying!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. "You are making this all up because you have always been jealous of us. Chad is a legitimate owner. We have certified public accountants. We have corporate lawyers. You cannot just come here and accuse my husband of working for a cartel. Your certified public accountants are currently sitting in federal interrogation rooms." "Chloe," I replied, not breaking my steady, lethal gaze. "We flipped your lead financial officer on Tuesday morning. He handed over the secondary encrypted ledgers to avoid RICO charges. He gave us the account numbers, the routing sequences, and the names of the cartel liaisons your husband meets with every month in Miami. The evidence on this drive is not a theory. It is a finalized federal indictment." Chloe stumbled backward as if I had physically struck her. She looked at Chad desperately, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to stand up and call me a liar. But Chad just kept his eyes glued to the stone patio, his silence acting as a devastating confession. "Every single pair of designer shoes in your massive closet." "Chloe," I said, making sure my voice sliced through her denial. "Every diamond tennis bracelet, every luxury vacation to Europe, this raw silk dress you are wearing right now. It was all bought with blood money. You sold your soul to a criminal so you could look down on me and call me a failure. And by tomorrow morning, the Internal Revenue Service and the FBI are going to seize every single asset you possess. They are going to take your house, your bank accounts, and your cars. You are going to be left with absolutely nothing." My mother, Vivian, let out a loud, terrifying sob. She gripped the edge of the outdoor bar, her knees buckling slightly as the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. Her perfect, wealthy son-in-law was a cartel launderer, and her entire social standing in Atlanta was about to be obliterated on the evening news. "David," Vivian cried out, grabbing my father's arm with frantic, clawing fingers. "David, tell her this is a mistake. Tell her he is innocent. We cannot be associated with drug money. We sit on the board of the country club." My father, David, did not comfort her. He stood completely frozen, his face turning a sickly ashen gray. His eyes were wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. He looked at me, then at Chad, and then back at me. His breathing became incredibly shallow. I turned my attention to the man who had just ordered me to beg on my knees. "And you, Dad," I said, my voice devoid of any familial affection. "You really thought Chad bailed out your failing commercial real estate firm 2 years ago out of the goodness of his heart. You thought he gave you a massive bridge loan because he loved his father-in-law and wanted to support Black excellence." David swallowed hard. He raised a trembling hand to his chest, as if he was experiencing physical chest pain. "Nia, no," my father whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute terror. "I just signed standard loan agreements. The money was clean. It came from his corporate accounts. I did not know anything about a cartel. You have to believe me, I am a respectable businessman. You were a desperate businessman who turned a blind eye to millions of dollars appearing out of thin air," I corrected him coldly. "Your real estate firm was the secondary wash, David. Chad used your commercial property acquisitions to clean the money that his dealerships could not process fast enough. You bought strip malls and office buildings with cartel cash. Whether you knew the exact source of the funds or not, your signature is on every single fraudulent property deed. You made yourself an accessory to federal money laundering to save your own ego." My father's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto a patio chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, letting out a broken, pathetic sound of complete despair. The mighty patriarch who had demanded absolute obedience and respect from me was now weeping openly in front of his friends, terrified of spending his remaining years in a federal penitentiary. "We had no idea," Vivian shrieked, tears ruining her perfectly applied makeup as she stepped away from my father. "We are innocent. We go to church every Sunday. We donate to charities. You cannot let them take our home, Nia. We are your parents. You have the power to stop this. You can erase those files. You can tell your task force it was a mistake. We are family." Family, I repeated, testing the word like it was a foreign language. "You spent my entire adult life treating me like a disease. You mocked my service to this country. You allowed this criminal to physically assault your 6-year-old granddaughter, and you stood by while he threatened to throw her into the foster system. You were perfectly willing to watch me be financially and physically destroyed to protect your lavish lifestyle. Do not dare use the word family to demand my protection now that your house of cards is burning to the ground." I picked up the silver USB drive from the marble counter. The sheer magnitude of their incoming destruction hung heavily in the humid air. They were completely ruined. Their wealth, their prestige, their arrogant belief that they were better than me. It had all been a fragile illusion funded by a criminal enterprise, and I was the one holding the match. The low, heavy rumble of approaching vehicles began to shake the ground beneath our feet. It was a completely different sound from the high-pitched wail of the local police cruisers that had arrived earlier. This sound was deep, synchronized, and massive. Through the wrought iron gates of my parents' estate, a convoy of 6 unmarked black SUVs came tearing up the circular driveway. The tires chewed up the expensive landscaping as they formed a tactical barricade blocking all possible exits. The doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. More than 24 heavily armed federal agents poured out into the warm Atlanta night, their tactical vests clearly emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. The localized, chaotic energy of the patio instantly transformed into a scene of absolute coordinated federal enforcement. The wealthy guests who had been slowly backing away suddenly broke into a panicked, uncoordinated stampede. Women in designer dresses tripped over landscaping lights. Men who ran hedge funds scrambled blindly toward the side gates, terrified of being caught in a federal drug raid. My parents' backyard looked like a disturbed anthill. "You actually thought I came to this anniversary party just to eat dry brisket and listen to you insult me," I said, my voice cutting through the rising panic as I looked down at Chad. "I needed physical proximity. Your cartel buddies are smart enough to keep the localized hardware wallets completely offline, disconnected from your dealership servers. But you are stupid enough to keep the master decryption key in the safe inside your home office, while everyone was outside watching you shadowbox and brag about your custom Porsche. I walked right through the kitchen, bypassed your pathetic residential security system, and cloned the entire hardware drive in under 4 minutes. I transmitted the final encryption key to my task force director while you were pouring your third glass of bourbon. Chad let out a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. He realized that the very party he had hosted to flaunt his wealth was the exact vehicle I had used to orchestrate his absolute ruin. He had literally invited his executioner into his own home. FBI Special Agent Harrison, a man I had worked alongside for the past 2 years, strode onto the patio with his tactical team flanking him. He did not look at the screaming guests or my paralyzed parents. He walked straight toward me, gave a sharp professional nod, and then turned his full attention to the man still groaning on the patio stones. Chadwick Miller, Agent. Harrison barked his voice, carrying the uncompromising weight of the federal government. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Two federal agents stepped forward, grabbing Chad by his uninjured arm and hauling him roughly to his feet. He did not struggle. He did not yell for his lawyers. The fight had been completely and totally beaten out of him. When the cold steel of the federal handcuffs locked around his wrists, the sound echoed sharply, finalizing the end of his untouchable empire. They patted him down, stripped him of his expensive watch and his phone, treating the millionaire dealership owner exactly like the street-level criminal he truly was. Chloe watched her husband being manhandled by federal agents, and her mind finally violently snapped. The reality of her situation crashed into her like a freight train. She was not just losing her husband, she was losing her entire identity. "Wait, stop!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing at the seams as she lunged toward the agents. "You cannot take him. We have an event in Buckhead tomorrow. We have a vacation to Monaco booked for next week. You cannot just come into my parents' house and take my husband. He is a legitimate business owner. Tell them, Nia. Tell them it is a mistake." Agent Harrison stepped into Chloe's path, blocking her from reaching Chad. He pulled a thick stack of folded legal documents from his tactical vest and shoved them directly against her chest. Chloe Miller Harrison stated flatly, ignoring her hysterical sobbing, "You are hereby served with a federal asset forfeiture notice. As of this exact moment, every single bank account registered to your name, your husband's name, or any of your joint LLCs has been completely frozen. Your primary residence, your vacation properties, and the entire inventory of all 7 luxury dealerships are now in the custody of the United States government. You are currently standing in clothes bought with illicit funds. You have absolutely zero financial assets to your name." Chloe looked down at the federal seizure notice in her trembling hands. Her eyes darted wildly across the legal jargon, her breathing escalating into a full-blown hyperventilation. The color washed completely out of her face. She looked at the massive diamond ring on her finger, realizing it was no longer a symbol of her superiority, but a piece of state evidence. She slowly turned her head and looked at me. The arrogant, vicious sister who had just threatened to call Child Protective Services and throw my daughter into a foster home was completely gone. In her place was a broken, terrified woman who had just been stripped of everything she valued in the world. Chloe collapsed. Her knees simply gave out and she fell hard onto the stone patio, tearing the expensive fabric of her raw silk dress. She scrambled across the dirty bricks on her hands and knees, ignoring the spilled drinks and the dirt crawling directly toward where I stood. "Nia, please," Chloe wailed, grabbing desperately at the hem of my jeans, her tears soaking into the denim. "Please, Nia. I am your sister. We share the same blood. You cannot let them do this to me. I have nothing. I do not have a degree. I do not have a career. If they take the money, I am going to be on the street. Please call them off. You are the major. You are the lead investigator. You can make this go away. I will do anything you want. I will apologize to Zuri. I will get on my knees and beg. Please do not leave me with nothing." I looked down at the woman clawing at my pants. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no familial warmth. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of justice finally balancing the scales. 20 minutes ago, I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of mercy. 20 minutes ago, you stood on this exact spot and smiled while your husband threatened to break my arm. You mocked me for being a single mother. You told me I brought zero value to this family. You looked me dead in the eyes and promised to use your wealth to steal my 6-year-old daughter and throw her into the system. You told me that blood meant nothing when I was a parasite. Chloe sobbed harder, shaking her head frantically, her makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her face. I was just angry, she pleaded, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. I did not mean it. I swear I did not mean it. I was just trying to support my husband. You know how he gets. Please, Nia, I am begging you, show some mercy. I reached down firmly, prying her desperate, grasping fingers off my jeans. I stepped back, severing the physical connection between us. You wanted me to learn that I was at the bottom of the food chain, Chloe, I replied, signaling to Agent Harrison that we were finished here. Welcome to the bottom. I hope you survive it better than you thought I would. The federal agents forcefully guided Chad toward the waiting black SUVs. He dragged his feet, his head hanging in total defeat, looking back one final time at the ruins of his opulent life. Chloe remained crumpled on the patio, wailing uncontrollably, screaming my name over and over again into the humid night air, but I had already tuned her out completely. I turned my back on her tears, just as she had turned her back on mine for my entire adult life. I turned my back on Chloe's tears, just as she had turned her back on mine for my entire adult life. I walked with measured, deliberate steps back to the heavy stone planter, where Zuri was still waiting. I knelt down on the brick pavers, and she immediately threw her small arms tightly around my neck. I scooped her up, lifting her securely against my chest. Her familiar weight grounded me instantly. The sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo cut right through the suffocating stench of spilled bourbon, cold fear, and expensive perfume that coated the patio. As I stood up with my daughter safely in my arms, the entire perspective of the yard seemed to physically widen, pulling back to reveal the massive scope of the wreckage I was leaving behind. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles painted the pristine landscaping in harsh, unforgiving colors. My parents moved to block my path to the side gate. The sheer naked desperation in their eyes was pathetic to witness. They were no longer the arrogant, untouchable patriarch and matriarch holding court over Atlanta's elite. They were cornered accomplices scrambling for a new lifeline. Vivian reached out with trembling, manicured hands, her tears completely ruining the flawless makeup she had spent hours applying. Nia, daughter, my mother, sobbed, her voice cracking with a manufactured theatrical grief. You have to help us. We did not know he was a cartel criminal. We swear to you on our lives we had absolutely no idea. You cannot just leave us here to deal with the FBI. We are family. You have to tell them we are innocent. My father, David, stepped forward frantically, trying to place a heavy, controlling hand on my shoulder. We can fix this, Nia, he pleaded, his booming voice reduced to a desperate, wavering whisper. We can rebuild the business. You have the power to protect this family now. You are a high-ranking federal officer. You can talk to the lead agents. You can tell them we were just victims of Chad's manipulation. We will do whatever you say from now on. I looked at the hands reaching out to me. I looked at the two people who had stood by and watched a grown man physically assault the child currently resting on my hip. I did not feel a single ounce of obligation, warmth, or pity. I shifted Zuri slightly and coldly swatted my father's hand away from my shoulder. Do not touch me, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute lethal finality. And do not ever use the word family with me again. You do not know the meaning of the word. Vivian gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her. But you are our blood, she cried out. I shook my head, staring through them with complete detachment. You spent my entire adult life obsessed with the image of black excellence. You thought excellence was the price tag on Chloe's raw silk dresses. You thought it was securing a country club membership by bowing down to an arrogant, racist white man who treated you like his personal employees. You were so desperate to maintain your status in this gated community that you gladly traded your dignity and your granddaughter's safety for a fleet of imported luxury cars and a renovated kitchen. I stepped closer to them, forcing them to back away. True excellence is not a designer label you buy with blood money, I said, making sure every syllable sliced through their delusion. True excellence is the strength to protect your own blood when absolutely nobody else is looking. It is the discipline to do the right thing when there is no wealthy audience to applaud you. You chose a predator over your own child because he offered you an easy paycheck. You are not victims tonight, David. You are just greedy accomplices who finally got caught. I stepped around them, refusing to give them another second of my time or attention. As I walked across the manicured lawn toward the exit, the remaining affluent guests parted silently. They lowered their eyes, completely unwilling to make eye contact with the woman who had just single-handedly dismantled the most powerful man in their social circle. The federal agents who were busy securing the perimeter recognized me immediately. They straightened their tactical vests and offered sharp, highly respectful nods as I passed through the heavy iron gates of the estate. I did not look back. I did not need to see the federal seizure notices being taped to the front door or hear Chloe's continued hysterical wailing to know that the toxic, fraudulent empire I had grown up in was officially reduced to ashes. I carried Zuri down the street to where my modest, reliable sedan was parked. I secured her carefully in her car seat, double-checking the harness. The heavy, oppressive weight I had carried on my shoulders for over a decade, the constant burden of their judgment, their cruel comparisons, and their conditional love vanished entirely the moment I closed her door. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the affluent, gated neighborhood that had always felt like a suffocating prison. The dark, tree-lined streets passed by in a blur, putting physical miles between me and the people who had tried to break my spirit. "Mommy, where are we going?" Zuri asked from the back seat. Her voice was small, but it was steadily returning to its normal, sweet, curious cadence. I looked at her in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I offered her a completely genuine, unburdened smile. I felt a profound, radiant lightness blooming in my chest. "We are going to get the biggest chocolate ice cream cone in the entire city," I told her. Zuri cheered, kicking her small feet against the back of my seat. The fear and confusion of the afternoon was entirely replaced by the simple, pure joy of a late-night summer treat. I rolled the windows down, letting the warm, humid Atlanta night air blow fiercely through the car. The city lights began to glow in the distance, vibrant and full of endless possibilities. I had walked onto that patio as the designated scapegoat, the quiet punching bag they thought they could humiliate for sport. But I had walked out as the absolute sovereign of my own life. I did not need their stolen money, their toxic validation, or their fake transactional family ties. I had my brilliant daughter, my hard-earned honor, and the quiet, unbreakable peace of a woman who had finally won her absolute freedom. My new life was just beginning, and I was going to savor every single second of it.